In 2020, I was featured in Toronto Life magazine where I went viral for purchasing over 20 rental properties by the age of 25, all while living at home with my parents. And it did draw criticism, but it also brought a lot of positive attention as well. Everyone thought I had it figured out. I'm here to tell you, years later, I definitely did not. I've sold about half of my portfolio since the article came out, and I've learned a lot of expensive lessons along the way, which I'm going to share with you. And no, I did not win the financial game of life. Again, some of these mistakes ended up costing a decent amount of money. So let's break it down. Mistake number one, as I was purchasing property, I wasn't focused on liquidity. In other words, I was buying properties without giving any second thought into the cash I had in my bank account. Most of the properties that fit my criteria were older properties that I can complete renovations to, refinance that property, pull out the money, and use it to buy another investment property. So when I was underwriting the cash flow for these properties, I would run some analysis like this, basically taking the rent, subtracting all of the expenses, and then putting some money aside for slush funds. The slush fund was about 9% of the rental income of the property. These would go into things such as capital expenditure. So that's things like the roof, hot water tank, furnace, cabinets, as things go wrong with the property, because these are old properties, to have some money set aside for that. But then it was also split with small repairs. So things like pest control, if there are leaky faucets, if I need to replace a light bulb, things of that nature. And then also with that, it also includes vacancy costs. A tenant's not going to live in these properties forever. A lot of these are starter homes. So if the tenant lives there for 3 or 4 years, they're eventually going to move out. I'm going to have to do some repairs to the house, and that house is probably going to be vacant for like 3 or 4 months until I find the right tenant. What I realize is that when I'm buying single family homes or small multifamily homes, these reserves are not going to be enough, especially since the houses that I was buying were built in the early 1900s. So there are already a lot of deferred maintenance in these properties. In these sorts of properties, any sort of repair, capex, or issue isn't a yearly thing. It happens multiple times in a year frequently. So the math and the spreadsheet showed one number, whereas reality showed another. Realistically speaking, single-family homes, small multifamilies are going to be extremely difficult to become cash flow positive, especially in markets in Ontario where prices were a little bit elevated as well. So when I was running the numbers, I should have built in a way bigger reserve fund and kept way more liquidity for each property. Mistake number two, cash flow actually got worse the longer I held the property. That sounds counterintuitive. The entire thesis of holding a rental property is that your equity gets paid down over time and you end up cash flowing more. But in a market like Ontario, there are so many factors that can potentially work against you. Number one, I mentioned it before, but I was buying older properties, so they were aging, a lot of repairs, a lot of things need to be done to these properties. Number two is that inflation went haywire, and as a result, all of my costs increased. So my insurance went up 5-10% in a single year. Utility cost is going up. Basically, the cost of everything is increasing. While that is happening, I can only increase my rents by the Ontario guideline set by the Landlord Tenant Board and Residential Tenancy Act, which is give or take around 2% on average. So while my expenses are increasing double digits, my rent is not keeping up with it. So my cash flow is getting thinner and thinner over time. And of course, I also had variable mortgage rates. And so my mortgage payment increased drastically during the massive amount of rate hikes that were happening in 2022, 2023. So what I'm seeing is that rents are increasing by about 2%, but my expense line is increasing drastically. So over time, what I'm actually noticing is that my properties cash flow less and less and less. And of course, as these properties bleed in cash flow, it's harder to maintain them and keep them up to shape because you're already losing money on a monthly basis. So I'm not saying this happens with all of my properties. It happens with the specific type of property. And my portfolio on a whole basis performed still pretty decently. But with some of the properties that were underperforming, I've noticed, again, there were smaller properties where expenses were skyrocketing and it's only 1 or 2 rents that I'm collecting. So the biggest lesson here is that your revenue line doesn't necessarily keep pace with your expenses. And to add on to that, rents in Ontario are largely dipping across most of the major cities. If you speak into any property manager anecdotally, it could take 4, 5, 6, 7 months to lease out a place. I've had units in a 5-unit property that I own that took about 5 months to lease out, right? And these are multiple units, not a one-off scenario. And I'm speaking with other investors as well, and they're seeing the same thing. So there's obvious downward pressure on the rental market as a lot of non-permanent residents are leaving the country due to policies implemented by the federal government. But also at the same time, there's a large amount of supply, purpose-built rentals that are also hitting the market that's further softening it. So then your vacancy costs are rising drastically. Your rents are declining. You're having more turnover as people move into more affordable units. And on top of that, your expenses, again, are still increasing drastically. On to mistake number 3, property managers don't make real estate investing passive. I was investing long distance. I live in the GTA, but invest in secondary and tertiary markets. And I figured a property manager will deal with all of my issues. That couldn't be further than the truth. Property managers are not necessarily incentivized to make sure that your property operates the most efficiently. They can make money off of repairs, bringing their handyman through, leasing, serving out notices, depending on the structure of the property management company. But in fact, I find that sometimes a worse tenant can generate more income for a property manager. So that's one thing to keep in mind. The second thing to keep in mind is that property managers don't get paid nearly as much versus the amount of work that they do for a rental property. So they're not incentivized to work hard. So let's say that you have a property renting out at $2,000 a month and your property management fees about 8%. That's $160 for a month of work to manage the property. Now, if your tenant is super keen to bring every problem to the property manager or calling the property manager over to visit the unit, or there are a ton of things going wrong with the property, a lot of things to coordinate, $160 is definitely not worth the property manager's time if you look at it from an hourly point of view. Most jobs can pay $160 in a day of work. Whereas with the property manager, this is a month-long effort of work to manage this property. So it's an extremely thin margin, rough business to be a part of. I don't blame them for not wanting to deal with every issue. So then what I found is that I started to have to manage the property manager and get ahead of things. For example, if a tenant didn't make rent payment, I had to issue notice. Well, the property manager would do it, but I would have to be on the property manager's butt to do it. So it was quicker if I did it myself. I would have to coordinate things with the paralegal, the LTB, because the property manager does not prioritize these things. And even when it comes to leasing, in a market like this where there are a lot of available rental units, they may not always prioritize your rental unit. Also, of course, property managers are not going to sit down and have a long conversation with the tenant if they don't make rent or try to understand why, simply because every hour is technically devaluing how much money that they make on a monthly basis, right? Or an hourly basis. So that I found myself having to speak with tenants as well because I was more patient. I had more invested into the process. So I found myself extremely involved to make sure that things were operating smoothly. And even with some properties, I decided to get rid of a property manager altogether and just self-manage long distance. So real estate is far from being passive. If you're not managing your tenants or the property, you're going to have to manage the property manager. So you got to pick your poison. Mistake number 4 is buying too many single family homes and concentration risk in a single asset class. To be clear, my entire portfolio is not all single family homes, but I did have a decent amount of them. And here's where the issue lies. You're relying on one tenant to make rent payment. If that tenant loses their job, all of the expenses are at the burden of yourself. And it unfortunately has happened to me. The worst part is that because you're landlording in Ontario, it could take about 7 months to get rid of the tenant. That could cost you well over 5 figures. Happened to me as well. Cash flow is thinner in a single family home. And if there's anything that goes wrong with a single family home, there's no economies of scale. For example, I had to replace a fire escape on an 8-unit property. Because there were 8 units, it cost about $18,000. It was less than $3,000 a unit. It was something I was able to handle and justify a bit more. But on a single family home, let's say a roof needs to be replaced. It's only one tenant that's occupying that entire house. So there's no economy of scales when it comes to big expenses. And oftentimes a furnace in a single family home is going to cost the same as a furnace in a multifamily home. A roof in a single family home is going to be pretty comparable to a roof in a small multifamily home. So your costs are way more significant and your tenant risk is way more significant as well. Now, it's not to say that you should avoid single family homes completely. They definitely do have the merit in a portfolio. But that being said, you need to understand that there are major pitfalls that can cost you a lot of money if things don't go your way. And reason number 6, I am sick and tired of dealing with the landlord-tenant board in Ontario. In Ontario, landlords can be pretty powerless in a lot of situations. I'll give you 3 quick examples of things that have happened to me over the past year and a half. One of them is that a tenant was supposed to be responsible for paying utilities, but they decided they were going to cancel the utilities in the middle of their lease. And so those costs got pushed forward to me. Unfortunately, it was signed up to automatic transfer, meaning that whenever someone took utilities off their name, it transferred back to my name. And so I found myself paying utilities for 2 or 3 months. I didn't notice it immediately, went back, told the tenant to switch it back to their name, but they didn't want to do that. My option was to go to the LTV, which is going to be 7-8 month process, and also have to hire a paralegal, get a bunch of paperwork together. It was going to take a lot of time. It was going to take money. It was going to be a lot of headache. I decided to sell the property altogether, just get rid of it, because I did not want to deal with that headache or issue. I ended up switching some of the utilities back off of my name at that point, but the utility company still made it my responsibility to be paying the utilities until the ownership changed hands. Number two, I had good tenants stop paying rent because they lost their job. And, things happen. I'm always happy to work with tenants and figure out what solutions there could be. But there's situations where tenants go MIA after they lose their job. You can knock on the door, they won't open it, they won't respond to phone calls, they won't respond to text messages. It happens. And then once that happens, you already know that it could be 10, 15 grand worth of cost to eventually get this person out. And in terms of trying to get that money back, it could be very difficult. If you don't have a tenant that cooperates, you have to take them to court, you have to try and garnish wages. But if the tenant doesn't have a job, if they're getting ODSP, it can be nearly impossible to get that money back. It's like squeezing blood from a stone, and you're just out all of that money. And lastly, I've had tenants that destroyed the unit before moving out. These tenants were self-employed, and so it would be nearly impossible to get that money back from them. And also, they disappeared, so it's very hard for me to find where they're located. I would have to get a private investigator. I'd have to do all of this extra work. And again, it's just headache that I don't want to deal with anymore, especially with the economics of being a landlord not necessarily being in your favor with some smaller properties, plus having to take all of that additional risk. I figured that I wanted to diversify outside of real estate so that I truly make some sort of passive income, which real estate is not, especially if you're investing in Ontario. Now, I know I spoke a lot about the learning lessons of real estate. I do want to make one thing clear. I'm not saying not to invest in real estate. A lot of my peers, my friends, they do invest in real estate. Even myself, I don't plan to sell all of my properties, although I do plan to get rid of most of my portfolio. It's not the right investment vehicle for everyone, depending on what your life goals are and depending on what your risk tolerance is, depending on if you're comfortable with leverage, not comfortable with leverage. But there was a lot of good that came out of real estate investing. Of course, I still made out ahead. I'll save that for another video, but just wanted to share this with you guys so you guys don't make the same mistakes that I did. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Subscribe. If you like more real estate content like this, leave a comment, share. Really appreciate it. Until next time, everyone. Peace.
This content is for general informational purposes only, and it's not financial, tax, or legal advice. While I am a licensed mortgage agent, I'm not your mortgage agent, and nothing here creates a client relationship. Everyone's situation is different, so please qualify and consult a professional before making any decision. If you'd like to talk through your specific scenario, book a call and I'll help connect you with the right professionals.